When a pilot slapped a young black woman in first class, he thought he was putting her in her place. But what he didn't know was that she owned the skies he flew in. Before we dive into this powerful story of dignity, justice, and courage, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tap the like. Because here on Black Journey, we share the stories they don't want told, the voices that must be heard, and the truths that lift us higher. Naomi moved through the terminal like a shadow carved from light. Her stride was calm, measured, almost regal. But inside her veins thundered with centuries of silenced voices. Cameras flashed from phones as passengers whispered her story, some glancing at her reddened cheek with shame for having witnessed it and said nothing. The recordings had already gone viral. Naomi could feel the weight of it rippling through the air. Yet she hadn't said a single public word. Not yet. A man in a Navy suit, head of ground operations, hurried toward her. "Miss Walker, is it?" His voice faltered, the recognition dawning too late. He had seen her name before, on contracts, documents that passed through hands high above his pay grade. But he had never imagined she would be here, walking through this terminal as both victim and owner. "Yes," Naomi replied simply, her tone as steady as a drumbeat. "Please come with me. We want to—" She cut him off with a glance that was not cruel but immovable. "No, I'll walk myself." And she did. Past the gates, past the murmuring crowd, past the airport staff who suddenly scrambled with nervous urgency. Naomi wasn't just moving through an airport anymore. She was moving through history, and every step reminded her of the women before her who had been forced to bow, to apologize for taking up space. Today she carried them all on her shoulders, and she would not bow. By the time she reached the sleek black car waiting outside, her phone was buzzing uncontrollably. Messages, missed calls, emails, journalists, activists, CEOs, even family. The world wanted her voice, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to give it. She sat in the back seat, the leather cool against her palms, and for the first time since the slap, she let out a breath so heavy it shook her ribs. Her driver, an old friend who knew better than to pry, simply asked, "Home?" Naomi shook her head. "Boardroom." Hours later, she stood inside a skyscraper conference room overlooking downtown Los Angeles. The city sprawled beneath her, restless and glowing. Around the long mahogany table sat men and women in tailored suits, the airline's board of directors. Some of them had worked with Naomi for years, never truly understanding her silence, her preference for staying out of the spotlight. Tonight, their eyes were wide with the realization of who she was beyond the numbers. "Naomi," the chairman began cautiously, "we heard about the incident. It's spreading fast." She placed her hands flat on the table. The sting on her cheek had softened into a faint mark, but her voice carried the wound with precision. "Incident?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "One of your captains assaulted me, in front of witnesses, in first class, and you call it an incident?" The room fell silent. No one dared breathe. Naomi's gaze swept over them, steady and unflinching. "I have kept my identity hidden for a reason. I didn't need applause, didn't want cameras. I invested in this airline because I believed in its vision. But today, your pilot reminded me of a truth I can't ignore. Dignity is not given by status, by wealth, by seat assignments. Dignity is human. And your company allowed mine to be stripped at 30,000 feet. The chairman cleared his throat, fumbling for words. "Captain Reynolds is respected. He's flown for us for over 20 years. Perhaps respect doesn't excuse violence," Naomi said, cutting through his sentence like glass. "And seniority doesn't erase racism." Her words hung heavy in the air. The directors shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at each other, others lowering their eyes. They were not used to being spoken to this way, not by someone so young, not by someone they had underestimated. "I don't want platitudes. I don't want press statements crafted to polish your image," Naomi continued. "I want accountability. I want policies that ensure no passenger, no employee, no human being will ever be treated as disposable. And I want it in writing. Now." "PUB," Chairman tried again, his voice smaller. Naomi, these things take time. Time, she echoed softly, leaning forward. Do you know how long my people have waited for time? Do you know how many generations have carried bruises like this one? She gestured to her cheek. We don't have time. We've already lost centuries. Silence again. The kind that presses into bones. Finally, a woman on the board, a black executive Naomi had always respected, spoke. She's right. If we don't act decisively, this airline will be remembered for its silence instead of its service. The tension broke. Heads nodded reluctantly, pens scratched against paper. The first threads of change were being woven, but Naomi wasn't finished. One more thing, she said. Captain Reynolds. He will never fly for this airline again. There was hesitation, but no one dared argue. They knew the world was watching now. They knew this wasn't just about a pilot and a passenger. It was about the soul of the company itself. By the next morning, headlines blazed across every major outlet. Silent billionaire backer of airline revealed after racist assault. Social media exploded with her name. Hashtags like dignity in the skies and justice for Naomi trended globally. For every voice that doubted her, thousands rose to defend her. The slap meant to diminish her had instead amplified her into a symbol. Still, Naomi felt the weight of it pressing into her chest. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. She had asked only for dignity, for silence to be broken. Yet perhaps this was what her grandmother had meant all along, that sometimes you don't choose history. History chooses you. Days later, Naomi agreed to a single televised interview. The studio lights were bright, but she carried herself with the same poise she had in seat 2A. The interviewer leaned forward, voice soft but direct. Naomi, why didn't you reveal your identity earlier? Why stay silent when you had such power? Naomi paused, choosing her words carefully. Because titles and wealth don't erase prejudice. I wanted to see the world as it is, not as it performs for a billionaire. But what happened on that flight reminded me, silence is its own kind of betrayal. If I have a platform, I have a duty, and I will use it. Her words rippled outward, reaching millions. Black travelers wrote to her, sharing stories of humiliation and exclusion in airports, on flights, in hotels. Parents told their children about Naomi, not as a victim, but as a victor who refused to shrink. She had become more than a passenger. She had become proof that resilience could transform even violence into legacy. As for Captain Reynolds, his name appeared in the news only briefly after that. He issued a hollow apology, but the airline terminated his contract. For some, that seemed like justice. For Naomi, it was only a beginning. In the months that followed, she spearheaded initiatives to reform the airline industry. Mandatory anti-discrimination training, diversity in hiring, anonymous passenger review systems. It wasn't perfect. Change never was. But it was movement, and movement mattered. One evening, months after the slap that had changed everything, Naomi sat again by a window seat. This time on a different airline she had chosen deliberately. Outside, the sky bled into twilight. Clouds, glowing gold. A little black girl across the aisle stared at her with wide eyes, clutching a stuffed bear. Naomi smiled gently. The girl whispered to her mother, who nodded nervously before allowing her daughter to approach. Are you Naomi Walker? The girl asked, her voice trembling with awe. Naomi leaned down. Yes, sweetheart. The girl's eyes shone. You're the one who wasn't scared. Naomi felt her heart catch. She touched the girl's shoulder softly. Oh, I was scared, she admitted. But I stood anyway. And you can too one day. The little girl nodded fiercely, as though storing the words for a future battle she hadn't yet met. Naomi watched her return to her seat, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. Not from pain, not from anger, but from the weight of knowing that the slap meant to silence her had instead given voice to countless others. As the plane lifted into the night sky, Naomi placed her hand against the window, feeling the hum of the engines beneath her palm. She whispered a prayer to her grandmother, to the ancestors, To every woman who had endured indignity and silence, we are still here, we are still rising, and we will not be erased. The city lights fell away beneath her, and Naomi Walker soared. No longer just a passenger in first class, but a force reshaping the very skies themselves. The jet bridge smelled faintly of metal and stale coffee as Naomi stepped onto Flight 873 bound for Los Angeles. She adjusted her ivory scarf around her neck, not because she needed the warmth, but because it grounded her, a small token from her grandmother that carried whispers of resilience across generations. At 29 years old, Naomi Walker had already seen enough of the world to know how people looked at her. The way their eyes scanned first her skin, then her shoes, then the section of the plane her boarding pass commanded her to occupy. Black, young, graceful, but somehow, at least to them, out of place in first class. She knew the drill. She had lived the drill. And still, every time it carved its way into her chest like a dull knife she refused to surrender to. Her seat was 2A, a wide leather throne near the window, set against glossy finishes that screamed luxury. She eased into it with the composure of someone who had earned every right to be there, though she knew her presence would stir whispers. Around her, other passengers tucked their coats into overhead bins, ordered sparkling water, adjusted ties. Naomi unfolded the airline's silk blanket and settled in. Outside, rain streaked across the window in erratic lines, reflecting the glow of runway lights. She reached for the folder in her bag, a quiet portfolio of numbers, acquisitions, contracts, papers that whispered a truth she had never advertised. She wasn't just a passenger on this airline. She was its silent shadow, one of the youngest billionaires in America, a financial backbone hidden in plain sight. She had chosen anonymity because she wanted freedom, to move without title, to be herself without expectation. But anonymity also meant invisibility. To them, she was just another black girl who, in their imagination, must have stumbled into a world reserved for the powerful and privileged. The flight attendants bustled in their routine rhythm. One of them, a middle-aged man with clipped speech and narrowed eyes, looked at Naomi as though she'd placed herself in the wrong seat. She returned his stare with a calm, measured grace. He didn't say anything, but she read the question in his silence. "Do you belong here?" The captain's voice soon filled the cabin, warm but mechanical. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We're looking forward to a smooth flight today." His name, Captain Reynolds, carried a certain prestige in aviation circles. For Naomi, it would soon carry something else entirely, something she would never forget. The plane lifted. The seatbelt sign flickered off. First class sank into the rhythm of whispered conversations, the clink of crystal glasses and the low hum of engines. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, resting her spirit against the rhythm of flight before pulling out her notebook. She had always kept a handwritten journal, a ritual passed down from her mother. Document your journey because the world will try to erase it. It was halfway into the flight when everything changed. A sudden patch of turbulence rattled the cabin, shaking glasses and sending ripples of discomfort through passengers. Naomi's water tipped slightly, spilling onto her tray. She reached instinctively to clean it, but before she could, Captain Reynolds himself emerged from the cockpit, an unusual sight mid-flight. His face was rigid, his jaw tight. He moved down the aisle with a strange urgency, as though chasing something invisible. Naomi noticed the way his eyes fixed on her row. At first, she thought nothing of it. Pilots sometimes reassured first class passengers during turbulence, but his pace didn't slow as he approached. He stopped at her seat, towering above her. His voice was sharp, laced with accusation. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone more interrogation than inquiry. Naomi blinked. "Excuse me? This seat, this class. You don't belong here." His voice carried, loud enough for nearby passengers to shift uncomfortably, though no one spoke. Her breath caught, but her dignity remained intact. "I have a ticket," she said, steady. She held up the stub, 2A, bold and undeniable. But he didn't look. His face tightened further, consumed by whatever prejudice stormed inside him. And then an emotion so shocking it split the air, his hand lashed out. The sound of the slap cracked across the cabin like thunder. For a moment, the world froze. Naomi's cheek stung with a heat that blurred her vision, but it wasn't the pain that unsettled her. It was the audacity, the unprovoked violence, the message embedded in his palm. You don't belong. You never will. Gasps filled the cabin. A woman in seat 3C covered her mouth. A businessman in 1D looked away, unwilling to intervene. The flight attendant from earlier shifted nervously, caught between duty and prejudice. Silence stretched, heavy and unbearable. Naomi sat still, her eyes locked on Captain Reynolds. She refused to shrink. Her grandmother's words rose in her chest. Stand tall, even when the world cuts you down, especially then. Are you finished? She asked, her voice low but commanding, the kind of voice that carried generations of resilience. The captain sneered, muttered something about standards, and turned back toward the cockpit. But the damage was done. The mark on her face was more than physical. It was historical, a reminder of every time dignity had been dismissed, every time presence had been questioned, every time a black woman's very existence was treated as intrusion. Naomi's hands trembled, not from fear but from the sheer magnitude of choice before her. She could disappear into silence, as so many had been forced to, or she could rise, not just for herself but for every woman, every black traveler, every person told they didn't belong. She reached into her bag, pulling out not just her journal but her phone. With deliberate calm, she began documenting. The trembling whispers around her grew into murmurs. A few passengers, emboldened by her composure, started recording too. Evidence, truth, the kind that could not be erased. The hours that followed were a blur of tense air and stolen glances. The captain did not reappear, but the flight attendants moved with unease, some avoiding her row entirely. Naomi, however, sat regal in her seat, the sting on her cheek now a burning emblem of something greater. When the plane landed in Los Angeles, the atmosphere was electric with unease. Passengers rushed to disembark, some eager to escape, others curious about what would unfold. Naomi waited until the last possible moment. She wanted the silence of an empty cabin. She wanted him to see her walk out not broken, not diminished, but whole. At the gate, airport security waited, but not for her. The murmurs and recordings had already begun circulating through social media. By the time Naomi stepped onto the carpeted terminal, the story had ignited. Pilot assaults black woman in first class. Hashtags multiplied by the minute. The air buzzed with outrage. What no one yet knew, what no one could have imagined was who Naomi really was. That this wasn't just a passenger humiliated, but a shareholder, a silent billionaire, one of the very people who owned the wings beneath his arrogance. And soon, the world, and Captain Reynolds, would learn.